Live from London, this is The World Today.
Hello, I'm Jamie Owen. Welcome to the programme. Our top stories: with hours to go, over 1 million people in Gaza try to find safety after the Israeli order to leave the north ahead of an expected ground operation. Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas tells Antony Blinken he rejects the forced displacement of Palestinians in Gaza as the US Secretary of State meets Arab leaders. The European Union's foreign policy chief in China says it's in everyone's interest to find common ground on thorny issues like trade and economic relations. And Living History, the virtual exhibition in London that takes you back in time to the hidden treasures of Chinese civilization. People in the north of Gaza have begun leaving to try to find safety after Israel issued a 24-hour evacuation order. Israeli defense forces have been massing on the border with expectations of a land offensive starting soon. The United Nations has urged Israel to withdraw the ultimatum, warning of devastating humanitarian consequences. The numbers of dead and injured people, both in Gaza and Israel, continues to grow. You might find some of the images in Yolo Abdavid's report distressing.
As daylight reveals another day in Gaza, it could be a day like no other. Most streets in this densely populated city are deserted. People are cowering after a week of bombardment. Then a different cargo. Tens of thousands of leaflets urging everyone in the north to leave their homes and known shelters. The note in Arabic also warns people not to approach the barrier that separates the Hamas-controlled Gaza Strip from Israel. The IDF, Israel Defense Forces, has issued the warning to more than 1 million Gaza residents, advising them to head south from the city.
The aim here is to minimize the damage to civilians. There are significant combat operations ongoing, and we are preparing for future and the continuance of our combat operations, and out of an understanding that there are civilians here whom are not our enemy, and we do not want to target them.
Dozens of funerals are held every day in Israel for the 1,300 civilians and soldiers who have died in the past 7 days. Many families are grieving twice for dead relatives and their loved ones who are called up to serve in the Israeli army. Israeli officers have released unverified videos of airstrikes against Hamas targets in the Gaza Strip. It's claimed that 750 military targets have been hit, among them Hamas tunnels, weapons storage and the homes of their leaders. But throughout this week, constant airstrikes through both day and night have unleashed a massive destruction on Gazans too. Teams of emergency services try to help where they can. Sometimes no help is possible. Those who are able are moving south. Not everyone will be able to.
It would look like a complete catastrophe. It would look like a civilian humanitarian disaster. This is the sort of language that is being used by the United Nations and rights groups around the world. I think the language isn't alarmist.
On the other side of the Gaza-Israel barrier is the ominous build-up of Israeli military power. The first incursion into Gaza since 2014 is looking increasingly likely. A new phase in the old conflict between Palestinians and Israelis. Yolo Abdavid, CGTN.
Well, let's talk now to our correspondent Stephanie Freed in Tel Aviv. Stephanie, obviously crucial hours ahead now. What can we expect from the Israeli side?
Well, you know, crucial hours, and Jamie, there's just so much that's happening so quickly. What we're seeing, the meetings and what we're seeing, movement, the meetings, arrivals of various people, Also commitments to security backing. I mean, it looks like also with this warning giving Gazans 24 hours to move south, it looks like either there would be a massive strike or a ground incursion, or I'm not quite sure what. But the understanding is because there's so much movement, it's in preparation, the flurry of movement, it's in preparation for something. It feels, you know, the sense is something is absolutely imminent. Today, Friday, I just came back from Jerusalem, and Hamas had called a day of rage. And of course, Friday is the Friday prayers at Al-Aqsa Mosque, which is Islam's third holiest site. The expectation was that perhaps there could be extreme clashes between Israel soldiers and border police and worshippers. We didn't see that. We saw a little bit of that. There was one person that some of the border police within the old city, a few meters from us, were shooting at that were on the roof of a structure of the old city, and that's because they'd shot off some fireworks. But otherwise, there were some clashes in the West Bank, and this was widespread, the Day of Rage, throughout this region, throughout Arab countries, as sentiments and emotions are quite high. I can tell you what's happening as well in the north of here. There are reports that Hamas has fired for the first time a 250 Ayash 250 rocket, which has a 250-kilometer range. That's the first long-range rocket. It's showing capacity and capability of Hamas. It's the first one that's been shot. It was shot down. We also have a community where that's a closed military zone, and within the past hour, 2 hours, we've had 2 reports of infiltration in the north, and we're talking about along the border with Lebanon as well. Ongoing rocket strikes, incoming rockets from Gaza to various cities throughout Israel. So this is very fluid, and a lot's happening very quickly.
The European Commission President, Ursula von der Leyen, is in Israel today. What do we know about her agenda and her visit?
Well, again, you know, when I was talking about the quick movement and the flurry of visits, support. I mean, that's what we hear on the surface, where she's also coming in, as well as the European Parliament President, Roberta Metsola. And later today, Germany's Foreign Minister, Baerbock, will be here. And that's following a visit by the U.S. Secretary of State yesterday, and the Chief of Staff, or the Commander-in-Chief of the U.S., who was here today. This is a flurry of visits. They're saying it's for backing, support, backing. One would assume that it's also in terms of, implied here would be military backing as well, military support, and backing that up is late in just the latest hours. We got word that the UK, Britain, will be sending 2 Royal Navy support ships to the Eastern Mediterranean, surveillance aircraft, and 100 more Royal Marines. And that's in addition to a U.S. strike force fleet that's arriving as well. So, yes, support, and support can take many forms, and that's what we are understanding.
As you say, I mean, there's obviously this frantic diplomatic activity going on in the background, but is the sense there perhaps that the time is past? All these diplomats are talking about is simply military support and diplomatic backing. There's nothing else on the agenda to be discussed in terms of resolution. That's all gone, and that's not possible. Is that your sense?
The sense, yes, among Israelis is, and certainly from the tough talk that we hear from the Israeli government, and the sense among Israelis is, time to talk is finished. Talking is, there's no negotiation, it's over. I would say that you have people visiting these the officials visiting from various countries. Also bear in mind, there are people that are kidnapped that have been taken hostage in Gaza, and these are nationals of these countries. So there's an interest there as well, also on the part of the U.S. But again, as we hear more and more murmurings and speculation around the ground and imminent ground invasion, is Israel going into Gaza on the ground. We are understanding from the Israelis that they've said this will be a long campaign. They're not going to back down. They're going to wipe out Hamas. What that means in terms of the Gaza's civilian population, well, we're sort of seeing the implications of that right now.
Stephanie, thank you for that. Our correspondent, Stephanie Freed, in Jerusalem. Let me take you now to Gaza and talk to our correspondent, Adel Al-Marouki, who's there for us. Adel, what more do we know about Antony Blinken's meeting with Mahmoud Abbas? I'm terribly sorry. I think we have the wrong feed there. I'm hoping that we're through to our correspondent, Akram Al-Satari, who's in Gaza. I think we're through to you now, Akram. If we are, let me ask you if you can still hear me. Hamas telling civilians to ignore the evacuation order we were reporting on earlier in the program. What's the situation where you are now?
The situation is catastrophic. Lines of people, long lines of people using their vehicles to move from the Gaza North to the Gaza South, and also people from the Gaza City are moving. Also, Israeli occupation air forces targeted 3 cars. It looks like a targeted assassination, and they killed several people who are in these cars. And that was kind of affirmation of the fact that the Palestinian resistance and all other factors were telling the civilians that are leaving their homes that they would be a target of the Israeli occupation. They would be a target of the Israeli Air Force. They would be killed or injured because of that. So this situation again is aggravating. People who are leaving their homes in the hope that they would move to somewhere safe are being targeted, and they're being killed and injured in the street. The situation is more than just catastrophic. When you try to find the humanitarian terms to describe the things that are happening on the ground, you would not find any appropriate term to speak about the situation that is happening. Large number of people, extremely large number of people are asked to leave their homes and asked to go somewhere in the Gaza South. They don't have homes there. They don't have relatives, and not all of them, of course. They don't have friends there. They don't have acquaintances, and they are lost, and they are amidst non-stop fire. For the past 7 days, fire has not stopped at all, and the Palestinians are killed and injured every single moment. I would say every single second. So if I was thinking of a specific appropriate term to be describing the situation that is happening in, and I could not find any. None of the provisions of the IHL apply to what the international humanitarian law apply to what is happening now. What is happening now is against the Geneva Convention, Protocol 3rd and 4th, for the protection of the civilian objects and for the protection of the medical staff and for the protection of journalists. I think every single right, and I'm quoting here many of the Palestinians that I talked to about this specific crisis, I think the provisions of the humanitarian law, international humanitarian law, Geneva Convention, the first and second protocols are being violated bluntly. I think the large number of being evicted from their homes is a violation of the international humanitarian law and of the international law and of the Geneva Conventions, but none of the major power is stopping anything. And again, I'm quoting some WH sources, some UNRWA sources, some UN sources who are talking about the catastrophe that is taking place in Gaza. So according to their words, this is a catastrophe that could amount to ethnic cleansing, that could amount to a war crime, that is really a war crime underway by targeting this large number of Palestinians and evicting them by force from their land. So bottom line, I don't have any specific word in the international law or in the any kind of a charter that has to do with the rights of people that can describe the violation that is taking place in Gaza right now.
Akram, thank you for that. Our correspondent, Akram Al-Satari in Gaza. Well, the Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas told the United States Secretary of State that he rejects the forced displacement of Palestinians in Gaza. The pair met in Jordan as Antony Blinken continues his tour of the Middle East in response to the conflict. The United States diplomat also met the Jordanian king and praised his country's special role as a force for stability in the region. Well, let's talk to our correspondent Adel Al-Marouki, who's in Amman for us. What more do we know about Antony Blinken's meeting with Mahmoud Abbas?
Blinken tried to seek some sort of opening dialogue with President Mahmoud Abbas, and it comes after several years of tension between the Palestinian Liberation Organization, the PLO, and the United States in general, based on former President Trump's moving or reallocating the U.S. embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. So this is one of the rare meetings where they have been talking together despite the tension that is ongoing. As you've mentioned briefly, President Mahmoud Abbas has strictly rejected any attempts to force an enforced exodus of Palestinians, whether that be in the West Bank so that they would flee to Jordan, or in Gaza so that they would flee to Egypt, and saying that Palestinians must hold tight to their land and refrain from what he called the extreme bombardment of Gaza to eliminate the city entirely. And basically the talks have also extended to discuss the catastrophic humanitarian situation in Gaza as the Gaza Strip runs out of fuel. It has already huge power cuts, and medicine is running out. Water has been cut by the Israelis on the Strip itself. So it is being, all the resources there are being depleted, and there is no safe passage for the humanitarian packages and convoys that are already arrived in Egypt on the Egyptian border of Rafah, but has not been guaranteed a safe passage into Gaza. So this was basically one of the main highlights for them to discuss that. There hasn't been much announced talk about anything about mediation efforts or political talks with the Israelis. It was more focused on the condemnation from the Palestinian president and securing humanitarian aid to the Palestinians in Gaza.
Blinken's meeting with Arab leaders is part of a United States plan to try and prevent violence from spreading right across the region. How will he be received?
Well, he's been already received with tens of thousands of protests in the Jordanian capital today when he arrived, and the protest stretched as he left the country and ended his meetings. Basically, there's an outrage and an outcry among the mass popularity of the Arab world. We've seen protests in Egypt, in Iraq, in Jordan, extended to the Islamic world to include countries like Malaysia and Indonesia as well. So there's a general outcry in the Arab world and the Islamic world against the ongoing war on Gaza. As for Blinken, he comes to repeat basically the norm stance of the United States, which is standing strong and abiding to its support to Israel. That includes by political power, by military power, and we've seen the U.S. Defense Secretary also tailing Blinken in his visit to Israel. And therefore, it comes adding nothing new, but what is really important here is how the United States can help out in the humanitarian access into Gaza. This is what is being the main concern by the Arab leaders and the diplomats, all who have been in contact with Blinken, and definitely this will be repeated throughout his visits as he goes to the rest of the Arab countries as well.
Adel, thank you for that. Our correspondent Adel Al-Marouki in Amman. You're watching CGTN. Still ahead, Europe's top diplomat tells China common ground is needed on the big issues like global trade.
Ever wondered what's the difference between a bear and a bull market? Where are the cash cows? And who are the lame ducks? And what exactly are black swans? Grey rhinos? And unicorn companies? Make sense of it all with Global Business, only on CGTN.
I think it should be more global cooperation.
I would like to hear more the voice of the developing countries.
Globalization has lifted more than 1 billion people. out of poverty.
The green transition has to happen. It's a necessity.
Well, China and the United States are important powers in the world.
What unites us is much more than what divides us.
And I believe China is committed to this agenda.
Join me, Juliet Mann, to set the agenda at these times every weekend on CGTN.
Hello, welcome back. A reminder of our top stories. With hours to go, over 1 million people in Gaza try to find safety after the Israeli order to leave the north ahead of an expected ground operation. The Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas tells Antony Blinken he rejects the forced displacement of Palestinians in Gaza as the US Secretary of State meets Arab leaders. Europe's Foreign Affairs Chief is in China for wide-ranging talks on global trade. Josep Borrell said it's become more necessary than ever for Europe to work with China and that there was a need to make the relationship less conflictual. Borrell's meeting with Foreign Minister Wang Yi could be a precursor to an EU-China summit later this year. Well, let's talk to our correspondent Zhong Chungying. Reports now from Beijing.
Borrell has met with Foreign Minister Wang Yi to discuss issues such as market access, Ukraine, climate change, and the evolving crisis in the Middle East in the first China-EU high-level strategic dialogue. And earlier today, he also delivered a speech at the capital's prestigious Peking University, where he said it was in the interest of both sides to find common grounds and address the current imbalance in bilateral economic and trade relations. And let's not forget that Borrell's visit comes at a time when the EU has just launched an anti-subsidy investigation into Chinese electric vehicle imports. And that is a move seen as protecting domestic markets in Europe and has strained ties between China and the 27-member bloc. And in his speech, Borrell raised the question of making China-EU economic ties more interdependent and less conflictual, saying they both need to work together more than ever. And here's a quick look at how China and the European Union economies are intertwined. Over the past 2 decades, China and the EU have become each other's second biggest trading partner. And take 2022 as an example, the value of China-EU trade hit nearly $850 billion US. And that is an increase of 2.4% year on year. And the experts I've spoken to say they hope Borrell, who stands on China might be described as pragmatic, but difficult to define, will use his visit to gain an objective view of the country and help the bloc's policymakers avoid strategic misjudgments. And they also argue that this is very crucial, especially given the importance of China to the EU on trade, climate, and other key fields. Zhong Chungying, CGTN, Beijing.
Well, that's the picture from China. Let's talk to our correspondent Alex Cadier in Brussels. Alex, what else has Josep Borrell been saying?
Well, Jamie, the message from Josep Borrell is that things between these two economic powerhouses could get worse before it gets better. Now, Josep Borrell saying that de-risking could accelerate if things don't change and if the relationship doesn't get less conflictual. Now, to give you a scale of this thing, no two entities in the world trade as much as the European Union and China. No one else. So that is really the biggest trading relationship in the world. Now, the question was posed by Josep Borrell. My question to China is, how can we make that interdependency less conflictual? And the message from the European diplomats is that China needs to do more. He says the cause is the result of persistent difficulties experienced by European companies when they want to gain access to the Chinese market. That's been echoed by the European Chamber of Commerce in China as well, who in their annual report just over a month ago, or under a month ago I should say, were calling for more clarity from the Chinese government as to how and if European companies were welcome to operate in China. Now, as you said, A response to that has been anti-subsidy probes in steel, in aluminium, jointly with the United States, but also that anti-subsidy probe in electric vehicles that are coming on the European market, which the Europeans see as hyper-subsidized. And finally, Josep Borrell warning his Chinese counterpart Wang Yi against transferring lethal weapons to Russia, and also urging against any escalation in the Taiwan Strait, particularly ahead of the Taiwanese presidential election in January. So a lot on the table, but the primary focus of this meeting by Josep Borrell, we'll have a listen in a moment, was really economic. Let's listen to what he said.
So it is in our interest to find common ground to redress this imbalance in our economic trade relations. Otherwise, we will have to accelerate the risking far more than good, as the public opinion will increase its pressure on political leaders to disengage more from China.
So that focus on the economy, on trying to be more aligned on foreign affairs, on international relations, that may help the economic picture, but certainly de-risking may accelerate if things don't get better. That was Josep Borrell's message.
Alex, thank you for that. Our correspondent Alex Cadier in Brussels. Now, travelling back in time is the stuff of science fiction, but a new exhibition in London uses virtual technology to walk in the footsteps of ancient Chinese history. Our correspondent Paul Hawkins was at the launch of Journey Through Civilizations.
This is as close as you'll get to a time machine.
I've just been in the cemetery of 2000, 3000 BC Chinese little village. Found out that the jade axe is a symbol of power for the local king.
It's an immersive experience, allowing users to travel back in time and learn more about China's 5,000-year-old civilization.
I've been to the museum of Liangzhu archaeological site, but it's sometimes difficult to imagine how the scale and this kind of presentation method give you a very direct, interactive.
Where are you right now?
Let's see, I'm by a river, obviously, and then trying to look for the leader of a tribute, I guess.
This immersive experience is part of the Journey Through Civilizations tour, a celebration of Chinese history and culture. As well as tech, there was also a panel discussion.
Well, I think it's important that we understand the history of China, what it's given to the West, and how we could reconcile with it. I think that's important, and I see this as something that can advance that.
Yeah, what's the biggest thing that Chinese civilization, in your opinion, has given the West?
Yeah, that's a good question. I would say that a lot of the things that the British apparently came up with were borrowed or adapted from China, but the Chinese weren't given the credit. And my own view is that if you gave them the credit and you recognise the debt that the British and the West owes China, you could start to go a long way to kind of get behind that iron curtain that's been created that divides the East from the West.
And time for tea. Next stop for Journey Through Civilizations is Geneva in Switzerland, connecting the past with the present. Paul Hawkins, CGTN.
The headlines again, with hours to go. Over 1 million people in Gaza try to find safety after an Israeli order to leave the north ahead of an expected ground operation. The Palestinian president, Mahmoud Abbas, tells Antony Blinken that he rejects the forced displacement of Palestinians in Gaza as the United States Secretary of State meets Arab leaders. And the European Union's foreign policy chief in China says it's in everyone's interest to find common ground on thorny issues like trade and economic relations. And that is The World Today. Thank you for watching. We're back with more news at the top of this hour. Coming up next, it's World Insight. For now, from all of the team in London, it's goodbye.
This is CGTN, China Global Television Network.